Hi and welcome. My name is Tolan and I'm the co-founder of Productivity Me. In this video, we're going to look at the structure of a workbook and a worksheet. We'll discuss things like what is a workbook, what is a worksheet. We'll discuss the ideas of columns, rows, cells, as well as ranges, selections, and the active cell. So if these individual topics are interesting to you, join us for this video. All right, if you want to follow along, go ahead and go into the description of this video, in which you'll find a link that will allow you to download the specific exercise file. So this file of 02.04. If you want to follow along with the same Excel file that we're using on screen, go ahead and download the link now. All right, so as we discussed earlier in the course, there is the idea of an Excel file. An Excel file is what's called an Excel workbook. And an Excel workbook is made up of one or more worksheets. Now, this sounds a bit confusing at first, but the idea of a Excel workbook is essentially just the individual file type. So there are going to be different workbook file extensions, things like .xlx, .xls, and .xlm. This is not something that you need to worry about when you are first learning Microsoft Excel, but a workbook is essentially just an Excel file, and there are different types or different file extensions based on how Microsoft saves the data. So a workbook in Microsoft Excel, or an Excel file, is given a name here, and this name appears at the top of a workbook. So the Excel file here is called 02.04. Now if we were to create a new workbook, if we were to go to the File menu and then go to New, we can create a new blank workbook, essentially a new Excel file. We click that, and you'll notice what happens is Microsoft Excel automatically gives this workbook a name. Because we've already created one workbook, that of Workbook 1, and when we go ahead and we create a new workbook, it's going to automatically name it Workbook 2. Now, it's going to remain called Workbook 2 until we were to save the file. Now, in a later video, we'll discuss on the idea of how to save this specific file, but we have this idea of a workbook. Now, a workbook is made up of one or more worksheets, and the worksheets are displayed here, and they're often named Sheet 1, Sheet 2, Sheet 3, and if we were to create a new one by clicking this little icon, it would be Sheet 4. So Sheet 1, Sheet 4, Sheet 2, Sheet 3. Now, each worksheet, essentially these individual sheets, is where we can input data and information. Now, the active worksheet here is indicated by the tab that's bold and green. So you'll notice that this worksheet here is a little bit different than these other individual worksheets. And so the way that all worksheets are organized is the same. First, you'll have a vertical up and down organization called a column. Now, a column here is indicated by a capital letter. So this is column A, this is column B, column C, column D, column E. And if we were to scroll over and go to the end of these columns, if we were to move over, we go all the way to XFD. And what does that mean? So essentially that means that Microsoft Excel is going to go all the way A through Z. And then once we get to Z, it's going to go A B, A C, A D, so on and so forth. And then you might imagine what will happen next. So after we go through A through AZ, which is the state name of Arizona, we'll then start with BA, BB, BC, and then it will continue on going CA, CB, CC, and eventually we get to 3-letter combinations. And you don't really need to know about and worry about it, but it's just a way that Microsoft Excel organizes the data. So we have these column letters or these column names, and these again are the vertical organization, the up and down organization of data. Now, the second kind of important component is the idea of rows, and rows are the horizontal organization, and they're indicated by numbers. So this is row 1, this is row 2, this is row 3, this is row 4, and if we were to go to the bottom of our data, we'll go all the way and to row 1,485, well, I guess 1,048,576. And after that, there are no more cells or there are no more rows that can be input into Microsoft Excel. So again, you kind of don't need to worry about this when you're first learning Microsoft Excel. The main takeaway is that we have workbooks, which are essentially Excel files, and then these workbooks have worksheets, which are essentially these tabs down here, and each worksheet is organized in the same way, having individual columns, which are indicated by capital letters, and individual rows, which are indicated by numbers. Now, these white little boxes here are what are called cells, and cells are essentially a reference or a coordinate of a column and a row. So you'll notice here, this is what's called the name box. And in the name box, you'll have the indication of your active cell. So currently we have our active cell in A1. So this is the intersection of column A and row 1. Thus, this is cell A1. This here is cell B2 because it's the intersection of B, column B, and row 2. Thus, it makes sense that this is cell B2. This right here is cell C2 because it's column C, row 2. Thus, this is cell C2. Now, when you have these individual cells, you might have a range of cells. And basically, a range of cells is just an indication of a series of cells. So if we had cell A1 and we had cell B1 and then we had cell A2 and cell B2, the way that you would write this specific range is A1 to B2. And if you wanted to write that out, you would essentially say cell A1, right? So that's the beginning of our range. Our first cell in this range is A1, and we're going all the way to cell B2, which is here. So we'd write the range of the first cell in our range, and then the second entry would be the last cell in our range. So this is a range of 4 cells, that of A1, B1, A2, B2, and our first cell in this range is A1, and our second cell is B2. And kind of as we progress through the course, even if you're not really familiar with the idea of ranges, or maybe I'm not explaining it super well, I imagine that you'll become more and more familiar and more comfortable with the idea of ranges. But the idea of ranges is just that you essentially have your beginning cell and then a colon and your ending cell. So if we were to say have a range from A1 to C3, the way that we would write that is our first cell would be A1, so it would be this cell here, and then we would write it as C3. So this here would be our last cell. Now, if we were to go to an example of an actual worksheet, right here we have a cell. This is essentially cell B1. It has a little bit of formatting, which you don't need to worry about, but the range of cells here would be A1 through F6. Now, a range can also be a smaller subset of data, so this would be cell C3, right? And this would be cell F6. So the range of cells that we currently have selected, that we currently have highlighted, is the idea of cell C3 through F6. So again, that would be the range of C3 through F6 would be this specific range here. Now, a range is slightly different than a selection because a selection is essentially the range of cells or the different cells that you have selected. So as we'll discuss later in the course, the idea of ranges becomes really important when we put in formulas and we use functions within Microsoft Excel. But a selection is basically the highlighted cells. So I have a selection of 1 cell here. Now I'm selecting 2 cells, 3 cells, 4 cells. Maybe I'd select this group of cells. So I have all of these individual cells selected. So essentially I would have the range of C3 through F6 selected. And then once you have a selection, you could make a change to all those things. So you could say, give them red text. So the idea of a range is that you have 1 or more cells, which are indicated by putting your first cell in the range, that of C3, and then our last cell, that of F6. That's our current range. Our selection is the group of highlighted cells, which in this case would be the same as a range of this individual set here of C3 through F6. So it's kind of like if we were to use the analogy of squares and rectangles, now you have a thing here, which is a square, right? And then you have another individual item, which is a rectangle. Well, this is not a good example because it's not the same type, but, right? So all rectangles are squares, or all squares are rectangles, but not all rectangles are squares. And I apologize about the spelling and typing, right? So all selections are ranges, but not all ranges are selections. Meaning that if we can refer to a range here, the range here is C3 through F6, but we don't have to select that. We could select a different range, that of D3 to D6. So again, ranges are basically an indication of one cell to another cell, and selections are basically just highlighted text. Maybe we'd move that over here. All right, the last thing that we want to look at is your active cell. And your active cell is going to be the cell that you're currently in and that you can make changes to. So if you were to type here, currently your active cell is indicated by this green box. So we know that our active cell is C3 because column C is highlighted as well as row 3. So again, if we were to make changes like type in some text, that text would be inputted into our active cell. Now if we have a selection, so let's say that we selected this specific range or this specific group of cells, that of D4 to E5. Now our active cell is going to be that cell that's in white. So if I were to say press the tab key, our active cell will change. The active cell is going to be indicated here in the name box. So currently our active cell is D4. If I press tab, it will be E4, D5, and then E5. So the active cell is the cell that we would be able to make changes in and say that we had the number 1, 2, 3, and 4. Currently our active cell is D4. Now it's E4. Now it is D5 and E5. So if I were to make a change, it would only apply to our active cell, that of D4. So I could put the letter A, and then this becomes our active cell. So then maybe this would be B. If I press the tab key, it would create this cell here of D5 into our active cell. And you'll notice that the white box always changes with our active cell. So A, B, C, D. All right, this was perhaps not the most concise video, and I apologize for that. But what we wanted to discuss was the idea of workbooks, right? So if we were to create a new workbook, a workbook is essentially an Excel file. Each Excel file or each Excel workbook will have one or more worksheets. The worksheets are indicated here. Worksheets essentially allow you to store and organize data. All of these worksheets are organized in the same way in that they have columns, often indicated by letters A, B, C, D. These columns also, or these worksheets, not only have columns, but they also have rows. Rows are indicated by numbers 1, 2, 3, 4. Now, the intersection or the coordinate of a specific column, that of column A and that of row 1, is called a cell. Cell is A1. This is cell B1, C1, A2, B2, C2, so on and so forth. Now we can have a range of cells, which if we wanted to reference the cell A1 through C3, the way that we would do that is we could click anywhere, and if we wanted to write that out visually, we would say A cell A1 through C3. That would be a specific range. If we want to make a selection, we would click in that, and we can drag our cursor over, and the selection is essentially the highlighted cells, right? So we have this selection, and the selection, essentially the selection that we make is a given range. In this case, the range of our selection is that of A1 through C1, but it could also go just to our selection is now the range of A1 through B2. And when we have our active cell is indicated either by this green box and the white, but the green box generally indicates our selection. So our active cell is the cell with the white box here. If we press the tab key, you can see that in the name box, our active cell will change. So again, that was a lot of information. If you have a suggestion of how we could more succinctly or more effectively explain these individual concepts, that of a workbook, that of a worksheet, that of columns, rows, selections, active cells, and ranges, I really appreciate your feedback. You can go ahead and leave whatever comments you want, as well as consider giving us a thumbs up or a thumbs down to help us get a sense of how useful this video was to you. In the next video, we're going to look at the idea of using the formula bar. So we'll look at this individual piece here and kind of how it can be used and how you might want to think about that. So if you're interested in the formula bar and how the formula bar fits into the program, the application of Microsoft Excel, join us in the next video. As always, thanks for watching, and we'll see you again soon. Cheers.